Scripture today starts in Ruth 1, 1 and 2. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And they reached Moab. They settled there.
I want to thank you, first of all, for name suggestions that you have made in the last week. We've got probably over a dozen new name suggestions, and if you were not here last week, you're welcome to put in any suggestions for the rest of the month of December as we explore a process for a new name. And there's also information on that out there in the corner if you'd like to pick some of that up. There's some articles and timelines. I just want to make mention of that because that's still available to you next week as well. We'll have an open forum. If you have any questions about that, you're more than welcome to come at noon next week to talk about the open forum. For the message today, it's from the book of Ruth, and I would like to let the story speak for itself. And in order to do that, I'd like to ask for your help. I need you to use your imagination this morning. For some of you, that's easier than others, but I want you to imagine 2 things. When I step on the stage, I'd like you to imagine that I am an elderly woman. And I would like you to imagine that I lived 1,000 years before Jesus. I'm going to take some creative, poetic license with the book of Ruth, but I hope this story inspires you to go read it this week for yourself in careful detail, because it's one of the most beautifully written, poignant, concise stories, in my opinion, in all of the Bible. So can you use your imagination with me? I'm not going to wear a wig or anything, so you've got to fill in the blanks, okay? I want to tell you my story. If you'll hear it, my name it's important. In fact, every name is important in my story, but I want you to know that I am not the hero of my story. Most of us like to think of ourselves as the hero of our own story. I've lived long enough to know that's just not true. I was born in a small town you never would have heard of. There's no reason to have heard of it. Nobody great's ever come from there. The town is called Bethlehem. In that town, like most small towns, not too much was happening. Most of my life was a solid upbringing. My parents were good, God-fearing parents. And most of us knew each other in town. It wasn't all that populated, so you got to know people as you grew up. Well, one of the guys that I got to know ended up being my husband. His name was Elimelech. Elimelech means God is my king, or my God is king. There's the first irony. Because we grew up in a time where there was no king. We had never known a king. We had never known any political leader that was singularly powerful like all of the nations around us. We grew up in the time we didn't have kings. We had what we call judges. And judges were kind of a combination of a part-time king and then part-time military general. God raised up these judges during times of crisis, and then they would defeat our enemies, they would raise up armies, and then they would kind of fade into history, and then God would raise up another one later when we gotten ourselves into trouble, and then they would fade out. But they never had the security of a king. They didn't pass down the throne to their bloodline. It was not quite the same sense of power and authority. So we were supposed to know, like Elimelech's very life reminded us, that God is our king. We're supposed to be a different nation with a king whose king is God. Which brings us to the second irony of the story. In Bethlehem, there was a famine Bethlehem means house of bread, house of food, and there was a famine. The only one that I know that controls the weather and the harvest is my king, and yet there was a famine. So Elimelech tried to do what most of the families in our neighborhood did. We sold everything that we had to buy food. I mean, by the time we were to our last dollar, we started giving possessions away for less than they were worth. We started giving everything away just to buy another day's worth of bread. And then he started traveling long distances, trying to find short-term work and seeing if we could make the commuting lifestyle work. But it fell short really quickly. So we decided we were going to do what we had heard a lot of other families in our region. We were from the region of Ephrath, and there was hope in the south. In Moab, there was some hope. People had sent back word and saying, there's no famine here. Things are going well here. We moved. We've settled. Life is sustainable in Moab. So we bit the grit and traveled to Moab. I took our sons, took everything we had left, which was not much. Now, my name is Naomi. I forgot to tell you. I like to think that my dad named me on the day I was born. My name means my delight. I like to think that as soon as he saw me, he picked me up in his arms and he looked at me and he smiled and he said, my delight. We're going to call her Naomi. I don't really know because my dad died when I was fairly young. And now all I have is my family in a foreign land. So we traveled to Moab. Now, every good Israelite knows about Moab. The name itself just sounds filthy coming off the tongue. Moab was, you know the story. Lot, relative of Abraham, had 2 daughters. The daughters were getting old. They couldn't find husbands. They couldn't find anybody to marry. So one of them has this genius idea one night to have their father impregnate them so they can have offspring, so they can carry on the family name. It's not the way we do it in Israel. But their plan worked. They got their father drunk that night, and the first night one of them slept with their father and got pregnant. The second night they got him drunk again. One of the other daughters slept with their father and got pregnant, and the firstborn son from that relationship was named Moab. Moab and Israel like oil and water. Enemies of disgrace. Just going to Moab. Moab was the place where when we were in our wandering years, in our traveling season, we were passing through Moab, and God gave Moab a grace. He said to Moses and the Israelites, just pass through Moab. Don't attack them. Don't make war with them. You're just supposed to move through. But as we were moving along in great numbers because God had blessed our ancestors, the king of Moab, you know this story, the king of Moab's name was Balak. He was scared of us. He didn't believe that we were just passing through. So he hired a prophet to curse the entire nation and send us back where we came from. That prophet's name was Balaam. And Balaam rode out on a hill to curse the nation, paid to do it by this king of Moab. But he couldn't, because God had blessed us. He only said a blessing over the people of Israel. And then he came back and he did it 3 times. In fact, you may have heard the legendary tale of the donkey having more sense than the prophet and speaking out the truth when nobody else would recognize, especially the king of Moab. We reluctantly moved. The only thing worse than living in Moab was watching your sons die in Bethlehem. So we made the journey about a week, And when we got to Moab, everything was strange like we expected, but at least when you travel, you have your family. It's the only familiar thing you've got when you travel. And we settled in fact, surprisingly easily, we became residents of Moab, and we carried on with a new life, and we made some new acquaintances, and we had a new normal. It was never intended to be a long normal. It was just a new normal for a period of time until Bethlehem's economic status got back up on its feet. But life became so comfortable that something happened that I really did not ever anticipate in Moab. Our sons started looking around at the Moabite women. I told them not to. I told them we're not staying. I told them this is a mistake. I reminded them of the stories that we had told them before, of when we traveled through Moab, our ancestors in the wilderness, and Moses was in the lead, and the men of Israel got too close to the towns of Moab, and they started intermarrying with the Moabite women. And then they started interworshiping with the Moabite gods, Chemosh and Baal, and they started leading their hearts astray, these women. And I told my sons, I told them, but there's a time, do you know? There's a time when your kids just don't hear you. Do you know what I mean? It's like your voice, somehow they have an immunity built up to your voice, and your wisdom, it just doesn't quite get in. Somebody else could come along and tell them the same thing. They'd think it's a genius. But somehow they just don't listen to you. So Mahlon married first. He married Orpah, and Kilion married second, not long after he followed his big brother and married Ruth. And I put on a good mother-in-law smile at both weddings, because it wasn't my choice. They were going to do what they were going to do. Well, to be honest with you, that wasn't the worst part of the year. I couldn't spend much time arguing the decision, because as my sons were starting their marriage, mine was ending. Elimelech, he'd always been my rock. But the cough started. The heat started. He started going down. It started with a lower energy day, and then eventually he was in the bed all day long. And it was hopefully one of those kinds of things where you're going to bounce back. You're just going to get better with a little rest, with a little care, and I cared. I cared for him the best I could care. But his body was shriveling away each day. And there's a time when your hope hits the first wall of question. I'm not sure he's going to come out of this. So I cared. I made food. I made everything I could make. We were struggling as it is with him being down, but the sons chipped in, and we took care of him as best we could. And most of the days during his last days, it was about 6 months. In those last 6 months, I was at his side, and I held his hand, and I put my cold hand on his feverish forehead, and I talked to him. And sometimes people would say, he can't hear you anymore. He's gone. He's not responding. Stop your breath. But I believed he could hear me right until the end. So I kept talking to him. Kept talking to my Elam and telling him, we are going to make it home. We did not come out here to die in Moab. You get better. You fight this. We're going to fight it together. Your sons are here. You're going to have grandchildren. You're going to see them grow up. You fight. You get better. God is your king. He's in charge of you. You have faith. You trust him. I'll be right here. And I was right there. I was holding his hand on the day. When he was gone, it was like a ringing in my ears, a constant, dull ringing in my ears, and the days just seemed like a long string of events. I couldn't even recognize the days. The ringing, it's like it isolated my head from everybody else. I could see things happening, but I couldn't engage in them. My husband was gone. I couldn't get out of that ringing. I watched them put him in the dirt. And all I could think of is, this is the wrong dirt. It's the wrong time. It's the wrong man. We did not intend to come live the golden years of our lives in Moab, and we certainly didn't intend to come out and die in Moab. This is foreign soil. These are not God-fearing men that are lowering him into this dirt. He was my reminder that God is my king, and if there was any comfort, which there was not, it would have been in the fact that our ancestor Moses was also buried in the fertile Moabite soil. On his last days, when he spent time with God on the mountain looking at the promised land, he died, and then God buried him somewhere on this God-forsaken land, in this wrong dirt. Losing my Elam stole the wind from my lungs. Then something happened that should never happen to anyone. It was like my sons followed their dad. Malon, just months later, the exact same road. The cough, the fever, the bed, the agonizing weeks. And he just faded away. And then his younger brother followed his big brother. The exact same road. Cough. And this time at the cough, all of our hearts fainted. He was the last one. You should never have to bury your kid. Do you know what I mean? If you've never lost a kid, there's no words to describe the confusion and how the sun just doesn't come up the next day, ever. Losing my Elam stole the wind from my lungs, but losing my son stole the blood from my veins. I might as well have been in the famine. I wouldn't have known because I didn't have any appetite left. Oddly enough, it was during that whole year that I actually saw my daughters-in-law for the first time and almost appreciated them instead of being jealous that they had stolen my son's affections and energies. I saw them at their husband's bedside, caring for him till the end, just like I had done with mine. And I loved them for it, Moabite or not. and I called them my daughters. And I realized maybe my sons were a better judge of character than I thought. I don't remember how I heard the word, but I heard the word that Bethlehem was back on its feet, and so I decided to leave this God-forsaken land and go home. I'd love to tell you that I went home with hope in my heart, but I went home as one walks to the grave, a final march. And as I started out for the journey, both of my faithful daughter-in-laws were right behind me in tow, and I turned to them and I said, "Kids, you're young enough. You've got a hope. There's no hope with me. Go home to your mother and father. Stay in their house until you can find another husband, and then start your life over and forget this tragedy. Go home." They both pushed. They both took another step and tried to come with me, and I pleaded with them again with a little bit of energy that I had left. Do you know what it's like to be exhausted from the moment you wake up? And I said, "Go home, girls. There's nothing here for you." One of them turned away, but Ruth just had this look in her eye, And I knew I best not argue with it. I didn't have the strength to argue with it. She even said this great line, something like, almost as if she had rehearsed it, "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." So I just decided if she was going to come, she was going to come. It would have taken her about a week. It took us 2 weeks on foot to get back to Bethlehem. Weary with every step. Much to my surprise, the town got word of us coming. Most of the women, friends, old friends, faces that looked familiar, just more wrinkled. They started coming out and they started greeting us and they started getting all cheery. They didn't know. They all gathered around us and started to hug me and said, "Is this Naomi? Is this Naomi?" But something in me just burst and I just blurted out to them, "No, it's not. It's not. The Naomi that left here was full, but this person that has come back is empty. Who is delighting in me now?" Everybody that delighted in me he stole them. He stole them. God plucked one by one everyone that I cared about from my life. Don't call me Naomi from now on. You'll call me Mara. Bitter. That's what it means. That's what God has made my life. It's bitter. They didn't really respond well to that. All of my friends took a step back. I could see the panic in their face. They didn't know what to say. They wanted to know what to say. But it was like I was in a cyclone of my own grief, and so they hovered outside of it. I did not have a plan for this stage in my life. I had just gone back to Bethlehem to finish my days and die. But it was Ruth that had a plan and had the energy to do something about it. She got up the next day, and by some fortune, we happened to arrive at the time of the barley harvest in late spring. All the barley fields were just ready. And so she said she was going to go out and glean, and I said, "Go out and glean. Do whatever you do, something for yourself, because I can't take care of you." And I watched her walk out to glean. It was our town's version of welfare. It was the Israelite version of welfare. If you didn't have a husband, if you didn't have a job, if nobody could provide for you, at least you could go glean from people's fields. See, by the Israelite law, by the law of Moses, you had to leave. If you had a field, you had to leave the corners unharvested. And anything you dropped along the way, you had to leave it down there so that people like us could come behind like rats and have at least enough to survive. I watched Ruth walk away, innocent, young, and I thought, I know how she feels. I know just how she feels. This was like I felt when I went to Moab, a strange land, going into a strange field with no protection now. You just don't, if you're a man, you just don't know what it's like being a woman in a man's field. Let's just say the men are not always kind. Without a protector, without a provider, they'll walk right over you, or worse. I waited all day, for Ruth to come back. And when she came back, she was smiling. So that got my hopes up. I wondered what was going on all day that would cause her to smile. So she came back and she told me the story. She told me about Boaz. And the name rung a bell. And as she described him, this was a family member, a distant relative of my husband Elimelech's. And she found favor in his field. He invited her to come there, and he even protected her. He even told all the guys, back off, don't touch her. Treat her kindly. And he gave her extra food. And she came home with enough food for all of us. And the next day she went back again because he had given her an open invitation to work in her fields. What a good turn of events. What luck. After days and days of this, it dawned on me that the barley harvest would not last forever, and this was not going to sustain my poor daughter-in-law forever. So we needed to make a move. So I told her how to make this move. Go to Boaz tonight. Get dressed up. Get a bath. Do your hair. Put on your nicest outfit. And when he goes to sleep, you go over to the corner of his blanket and you uncover his feet and you ask him in your perfume-scented voice, you ask him if he would spread the blanket over top of you. Now don't misunderstand this. This is Ruth. Everybody knows Ruth is a person of highest character, and Boaz was renowned for being a man of God. This was not an act of seduction as much as it was an act of judicial maneuvering. She was asking him to spread the blanket over top of her, which meant to be her kinsman redeemer, to fulfill the family oath, to marry her, like the law said, because she was a relative widow. So she did. She followed out the plan. And Boaz stepped up to the plate, and that very next day, he went and carried out the legal transaction in the town and married Ruth. And I thought at least one thing worked out in this story of a debacle and a disaster. Something worked out for the good. It was about a year later that Ruth gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She named him Obed. And on the day he was born, she brought him over and put him in my arms. And it was then when I looked into this baby's eyes for the first time, a flash of enlightenment hit. It was like a streak of lightning. I could see the puzzle pieces moving, and I could see the irony twist, and I realized maybe it wasn't God who was impoverishing the land. Maybe it wasn't God who was ripping out my family members with greedy claws. Maybe God, in his own way, his own mystery, was working behind the scenes, pulling the strings, responding to this broken, vile world with gentle streams of goodness. Maybe it wasn't just Boaz, who was our protector and our redeemer. Maybe it was God who, working through Boaz, set up a boundary around my family and provided for us when we had nothing. Maybe it wasn't just Ruth that stood by my side, refusing to leave me during my crisis, that would go any distance. Maybe it was God through Ruth that was walking the long road, weeping with me. Maybe it wasn't just Obed that I was holding. Maybe it was God's hope that was born again in the midst of terrible loss, that said there's a future. Maybe it was God who brought my friends around me and they could see my life more clearly than I could. And they reminded me kindly through my despair that I am blessed, that God is with me, that I am Naomi. This is my final word to you. You don't know how the last pages of your life will be written. You don't know. So don't be too quick to assume you know the ending. Don't be too hasty to throw all the blame on God for all the wrongs that have happened to you. If God saw me, He sees you. Maybe someday God can use my suffering. Maybe someday God can use my grandson or my great-great-grandson to change the world.
So Boaz took Ruth into his home, and she became his wife. When he slept with her, the Lord enabled her to become pregnant, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women of the town said to Naomi, "Praise the Lord, who has now provided a redeemer for your family. May this child be famous in Israel. May he restore your youth and care for you in your old age. For he is the son of your daughter-in-law who loves you and has been better to you than 7 sons." Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. The neighbor women said, "Now at last Naomi has a son again." And they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse and the grandfather of David.
Will you stand with me for the sending? Some generations later, there was another child born, and he really did change the world. May the love of God, the peace of Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you as you go. You are sent, church.